Welcome to the Soul Grit Podcast. I'm Ann Taylor McNeese, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I also love Jesus, and I'm passionate about all things gospel and therapy. I created Soul Grit to be at the intersection of mental health and Christian faith. Christ followers need a place to ask questions and get answers about mental health. Join me as we dive into real stories and real questions from people who want to honor God with their hearts, souls, and minds. Hey, welcome back to the Soul Grit Podcast. This is Anne, and I'm here today with my friend Gary Quan, who is actually a classmate from my days at Western Seminary. And we became friends, back in the earlier 2000s and went through our program together. And now Gary is working as a therapist, but also as a professor for students who are learning the therapy profession. But today he's here to talk to us about his time working in the jails. I did have a request from someone who listens to the podcast regularly. She wanted to hear about what mental health treatment or services are like in the prison system. I don't actually know somebody who's in like the state prison, but I did know Gary, and I know that you've worked in the jails for a while. So welcome, Gary. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you, Ann. It's great to see you again. I know it's been quite some time, and hope our paths cross in person again at some point.
For sure.
Name is Gary Quan. I hope this podcast is edifying to the person that requested the topic.
Yeah.
I've been a licensed therapist for almost 8 years now. I've been involved in the field as an internist for over 14. Wear a variety of hats. I teach right now at 3 different colleges, actually 4 different colleges, not to humble brag, but also doing group therapy, which is my passion and love. And then my other passion and love, which is aside from ministry, is actually going into the jails and teaching, teaching substance abuse, addiction, and counseling to right now over 30 students, both male and female. So it's been a rather interesting couple of months, and keeps me always on my toes. And I just appreciate that God's provided the opportunity to do this stuff meaningfully.
Yeah. So I was thinking that it's been, at least a decade, maybe 12 years since we really got to sit down and talk about anything. But over that course of time, I've, follow you on social media, things like that. And I've seen some pretty funny, crazy stories coming out of the jails.
And outside of the jail.
Yeah, that too. And so some of the questions that I thought would be interesting to talk about today is just what role do you think that mental health plays in people spending time incarcerated?
I've been wondering about that question since actually earlier in the week. And I think there's 2 clear paths that I'd like to share with your people. One, we have a system where essentially we are incarcerating people that are severely mentally ill, and it speaks to a toxic system. And again, not to blame any particular government entity or any jail folks or even mental health folks, but I think if we step outside of ourselves and look, we no longer have a great solution for our severely mentally ill population. And oftentimes they are recycled through our jails and our homeless shelters and county sort of sponsored housing. So that's one group that continues to be perpetually going through this ugly cycle and not necessarily getting better mentally, but also just in terms of having safe housing here in one of the most expensive areas in the world, obviously. And there's another group, I would call it more sort of environmentally affected folks that being first timers in a jail, but I would also include in that group people that are detoxing through jail. Again, we have quite a bit of a painkiller and methamphetamine epidemic here in Northern California. Yeah. And oftentimes people will find themselves essentially down a rabbit hole into this jail system and prison system. But particularly for our county jails, the first time someone gets arrested, there's often a traumatic response to being in the jail lobby for the first time, and then being housed, particularly for our female clients, our female inmate clients, being in dorms with anywhere from 35 to previously 75 other women. When I used to do groups in the dorms, I would ask them, I bet none of you ever imagine yourself living with 32 other people, or doing a group therapy with a bald guy and 15 other people. And many of them would say, yeah, and so I think it's sort of this interesting dichotomy of, the system that continues to cycle people through until, frankly, their demise. And then this other crew of folks that possibly are at risk and sometimes end up in this first bucket,
Yeah.
but then they have a difficult time sort of rediscovering themselves after they leave custody. Since, typically people don't spend a terrible amount of long time in the county jail system beyond, ideally 6 to 12 months, but sometimes I know it goes a little bit longer.
Mm-hmm.
So hope that answer makes sense. It's basically almost like two and a half buckets of people groups that really, particularly for the first group, that I've worked a good amount of my career with criminal justice populations, and that is the group that is quite the saddest to observe, and while supporting, obviously, but to observe this interminable sort of decline,
Yeah.
given that they have to interact and not have that many advocates in the system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm really interested in what you said too about people who really feel traumatized by that kind of introduction to the system. Like all of a sudden you're in this place with all these other people who are having a really rough time, and things aren't pretty. And so do you feel like when you're working in that context, are you dealing with a lot of trauma?
Yeah, you mean for myself or for the folks that are in the chair?
Probably both. I meant for the
Yeah,
people, but you probably get some
yeah,
secondary
yeah.
trauma too.
Yeah. There's really, out of respect for my people in custody that work in custody, my sheriff's friends as well as my mental health friends. I'll just give a general description for folks. If you, particularly our male orientation, you are brought into any number of holding tanks, holding cells, or if you're considered well enough, you'll often wait in a lobby and be seen by a nurse. But the room itself, there's a sort of a running joke in the jails. I love cold weather. For some reason, I love cold weather, but the temperature, I believe, is usually kept very low in order to prevent any sort of bacterial, viral sort of spread. So you have this essentially ice box of a large room of a lobby, where many men are interviewed by people like myself. If they are primarily at risk to themselves or other people, if they have any sort of special affiliations as determined by the sheriffs, and then primarily around mental health needs, because again, back to that first bucket of people, they will often relapse on their drugs of choice, typically methamphetamines, and then need something to offset that drug intoxication while they come into custody, before they act out or before they further decline. The term they use is decompensate, but I like decline as just a better description. On the female side, and this will highlight, perhaps we will touch upon just the disparities between men and women, but the women's lobby is smaller, obviously, and I think the logic is that there just are more men arrested in general, but the space, at least the last time I was there at the jails in 2020, the space is smaller, much more confined. And so when you talk about trauma vicariously, and also people that experience it there, oftentimes the most difficult times were when I was interviewing female clients with the sheriffs there, and then you might have the one person that's screaming louder than any other person in the lobby. And so it's hard to approximate anything that, other than going to a sporting event where you're cheering for the opposite team, and that's sort of the level of like the noise comparatively.
Yeah.
So that, I'm huge on terms of trauma informed treatment, and having toxic noise around really is, it can affect people's, not just their hearing, but their central nervous system functioning and their sympathetic nervous system functioning. And so for those of us who are fortunate to have a break room to go back to, we could at least escape the noise for a while, but then having to go back into the mental health interviews in that area was often difficult for both the sheriffs and inmates, as well as the mental health staff, as well as the nursing staff. So think of it as a collective trauma experienced by everyone.
Yeah, well, I never even realized that was, one of the first experiences that people would have going into that.
Right, right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. What kinds of treatments? So, say somebody's there in the jail for 6 to 12 months, as you said. What kinds of treatment or activities are they going to participate in during that time?
Sure. Uh, Thankfully, I'll start with what's available now compared to, let's say, when I started in May 2016. Thankfully, the mental health management has done a wonderful job of building a medical record management system that's robust enough to handle more business, so to speak. Before, I recall very many times in my first few months, just paper referrals, and if they happen to get lost, then we wouldn't get to see them. So sort of very draconian methods that have since been expanded. And then I started off as a crisis mental health person, and so if you can imagine what that sounds like, it is exactly what it sounds like. Interviewing people that were designated as perhaps worthy of mental health services coming in at intake, and then also for folks that were suffering from acute sort of distress. Obviously, jail. There's different sort of security housings, and there's different designations for people based off of whether it's gang affiliation or sex offender risk, that sort of stuff. And so, oftentimes we would take referrals in our new system, and then the management was responsible for working with the staff to determine who would serve what areas. And so that sort of evolved, I think around 2017, 18, 19 into, when I first started for 6 months, I was recruited pretty heavily to something called the BHT. And I kind of wondered what the BHT was. And it's a sort of behavioral health teams. So think of them as roving teams that served neighborhoods in the jails. And so at least here in Santa Clara County, there are two county jails. One is main jail in downtown San Jose, nearest to the airport, and then there's a second jail called Elmwood Correctional Facility for lower security folks in Milpitas. And so I spent quite a bit of time shuttling back and forth between the two facilities. But so there's the mental health intake at intake, and it's primarily to get them in front of a psychiatrist and possibly a psychologist for testing, and apparently medication regimen prescriptions. And then the crisis method, and then the BHT teams were essentially constructed to provide more on the ground support for high risk areas in the jail. And so here's where I will say, unfortunately, there was a inmate death, I believe, before I came along in 2016, of a severely mentally ill inmate who was beaten to death neglectfully by several officers, and they were since prosecuted and sent to prison. But as a result of that, they opened up a lot of funding for mental health workers to come into the jails, and that's how I ended up there initially. And then as the revenue came, or not revenue, sorry, that's the wrong term, but as the monies came in to provide for more services, I think that's where the behavioral health concept came to be. And so I would just say personally and professionally, maybe to both my benefit and detriment, I tend to be a late adopter of requests like being recruited to different teams. And so I waited for a while because I frankly wanted to get better at my job and go around different areas of the jail and support folks. I tend to be more idealist in that way. But when I did join the BHT team, I specifically wanted to work with low security or regular security women in dorms because I saw, at least for me, I see the world probably a little differently than most folks, but I saw an opportunity to provide both counseling services while reducing a large amount of what I would call crisis referrals.
Yeah.
So I saw this opportunity to edify a larger group of people through therapy and follow-up, then eliminate altogether sort of, when I say there's no such thing as a needless referral, but what I suggest is that there's folks that see, let's say, hey, how come Ann got to get a counselor? I need one too, right? And then oftentimes when someone would come out and ask them, how are you feeling? How are you doing? At times, depending on who came out, right, to see the inmates, they would turn them down. So there was an inefficient system that I saw there that I wanted to take the chance and opportunity to provide more deeper support, but also coverage for the particular neighborhood I was in.
Yeah.
And so I had a pretty good thing going there for about 18 to 24 months. Was doing anywhere from 3 to 4 groups a week, averaging 50 to 75 inmates per group, meaning, for the 3 groups. And then also as a follow-up to those that requested, individual therapy. And obviously, let me describe the individual therapy. Some folks, who are in jail are comfortable providing full therapy sessions. I have a good friend who provided trauma therapy using EMDR. And so it would often be quick stuff. And then some folks would frankly do just risk assessments. Do you feel like hurting yourself or other people? Are you surviving your doorman? And then for me, I was probably somewhere closer to my friend's thing, which is where, not trauma trained, by the way, didn't EMDR or brain spotting just yet. COVID kind of killed all of that
Yeah.
CEU type of stuff for me. But given the opportunity to pull a female inmate out of the dorm just to talk in a, I mean, the offices I had and typically were either the laundry room or the mat storage room for the beds, or a converted cell that was like 8 by 8,
Yeah.
often teeming with ants and other
Ugh.
vermin sometimes. And so I just wanted to provide a level of dignity and respect, as well as a lot of my colleagues, to provide dignity and respect to these inmates for that period of time. And so often the sessions wouldn't go any longer than 10 to 20 minutes, only because, again, part of the logic is if they're going back into a dorm, the other people want to know, hey, what did you talk to them about? Like, why are you in there so long?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's weird how that logic works in this system, but
Hmm.
and so the system I constructed with my manager's help really worked for a while, up until right around COVID started.
Hmm.
Again, not to put all the blame on the COVID period, but once April 20, no, March of 2020 came around, that sort of went where the things went off the rails for a lot of the in custody treatment
Yeah.
stuff. And so, um, I've been out of there for a while, and I don't pretend to know what's happening specifically, but I know there's a heavy focus on severely mentally ill folks
Hmm.
that I, as odd as it sounds on your podcast, don't necessarily agree with, because in essence, the research supports that basically pills and groups do support that particular population. But what I'm seeing is more and more people falling into that first bucket of people.
Hmm.
And so for me, I've always geared my sort of creative thinking in my career towards interventions that do more prevention than, that whole thing of an ounce of prevention versus a pound of treatment sort
Hmm.
of approach. And I think mental health does need to head in that direction, while
Yeah.
obviously having good people like yourself and myself helping out severely mentally ill. But at times it was painted as Gary's only going to help out the people that are well. But I'm like, who's well in here? We're all in jail. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
someone's been on meth for 5 years. And so I think the idea is that, and you remember the old GAF score system, right? The global assessment of functioning scale from 0 to 100.
Hmm.
In my head, I think for someone that's much more lower in the scale, so long as there is prescribed medications, antipsychotics that can help, or mood stabilizers that can help them, and then you have great folks like my colleague Tom that can do trauma therapy, I
Hmm.
think that met the requirement, to be quite fair. Again,
Hmm.
I'm not in management, but I think we lost a lot of people through the cracks, particularly our female inmates that would often, I would see them skid towards their wellness decreasing to where they would end up in that severely mentally ill bucket over a period of time. And that's one of the tragic things to
Hmm.
observe people do over a period of time, is they don't get better, but in fact they get far, far worse.
Yeah. Well, I think that we see that there needs to be people, therapists or other professionals that are helping each of these different kinds of people. Like everybody needs help or they wouldn't be there. But I think similarly to what you're thinking, you have to maximize your energy, your effort on where it's going to do the most good or have the chance to change or increase the potential of these certain women. Similarly, like when I worked in schools, I started feeling like, gosh, I can see this kid, I'll pull him out of his class for 15 minutes and do something. But if I could get the parents for an hour, that might make bigger difference in the family system. So it seems
Yeah.
similar.
Yeah, and it seems like we're aligned in terms of taking a systems approach. Again, I'm would like to be trained in Bowen family systems, but I'd like to say I'm an adherent to Bowen family systems.
Yeah.
And so I not only see the person that's in there, but typically for my female inmates, they're a mother.
Hmm.
They often were an auntie. There's sometimes I had grandmothers in there,
Hmm.
and so their only connections to anything meaningful would obviously be each other. But I saw the opportunity to provide emotional intelligence services. I think
Yep.
one of the cooler things that I had the chance to do with my manager's blessing several Christmases ago was, knowing that how much we need to be around safe people to have proximity to people. Started a grief group during the month of December
Wow.
for the female inmates, and so we did away with all the other group components and workbooks and stuff, but just did a 4 week short term group
Hmm.
modality related to grief. And so one of the interesting thing was, we'd start as a group together in a big table, and then just creatively, I put a table for grieving, so there would be plenty of tissues and, well, in this case, toilet paper or any sort of napkins that they could cobble up, and they got to cry there, right? And then there was another table that I was frankly most proud of, where they got to write letters to their children, right? Because one of the oddest things that I've seen just from as a clinician is, they get arrested, and there is a stigma with mommy getting sent off, or auntie or grandma getting sent off to jail,
Mm-hmm.
or a 4-year-old that doesn't know what jail is. But I said, I want you all thinking about the 4 to 6-year-old or 8-year-old or even 18-year-old at home that desperately misses their mom or their sister or
Yeah.
their family member. And so we do need to, and sometimes I do the reality therapy very well, and sometimes it backfires. But the reality therapy there was essentially, you have all this time. I'm only doing one group a week with you, so write the letters. Take the 90 minutes to write letters. There was a third table for meditation, and then a fourth table for, granted, I'm not trained in EMDR or brain spotting per se, but one of the nice creative things, I was known as a stuffed animal guy at the jail, because I would bring stuffed animals that were, perhaps something like this, where nothing that could be used as a weapon on this thing, and so they would be able to self-soothe by holding a stuffed animal. And so there's something about the production of oxytocin and vasopressin when you're holding onto something safe.
And for those of you that aren't seeing, but you're just listening, he's holding Doug from the movie Up, right?
Yes.
Yeah. That's the dog that can speak with the collar.
Right.
It's just a nice stuffed animal that looks very huggable.
Yeah, and so the creative thing is, Kohl's would have a sale on all their stuffed animals that we got Christmas every year. So I loaded up on these guys and would bring them into the jails during groups. And the both heartening thing, but also the most saddest thing I would see was watching some of these hardcore gang affiliated women, and then we'd do a process group, and all of a sudden they'd be holding a stuffed animal and nurturing the stuffed animal as they would a baby or a daughter or a son. And so I think that's where, in terms of for your uh, uh, podcast supporters, I think one of the most important things is we are social creatures. We are tactile creatures. We need safety. And so I think that was one of the things I was most proud of, is that this guy who has nothing to do with anything comes in and, supported by my manager and team, to do groups and to provide services where they process, right? I might come up with a few topics, but essentially I was responsible for providing a safe space inside of a inmate dorm, with the other folks sleeping or doing their thing, but maintaining a quiet neighborhood, right? But allowing anywhere from 12 to 20 women to say, hey, listen, like, maybe I shouldn't be taking my man's charges, maybe I shouldn't be here. How can I, what can I do at court? How can I best advocate for myself at court? And I wanted to provide the women the empowerment themselves to do that crucial work to uplift each other. We had a run where a lot of white collar crimes with Asian people, which I know that's another stigma in terms of Asian people don't go to jail, but there was quite a few people that would end up in jail. So they would start their little ESL sort of thing, English as a second language thing. But there were also primarily Spanish speaking women that wanted to come to group. And so you'd have someone that would sacrifice their time to be their interpreter when they wanted to listen or share. So it was really sort of this interesting kismet that happened just out of accident, to be quite fair. I don't take much credit for it, but I think once that opportunity opened up for itself, I and many other folks in the teams were able to do this work critically in the jails to the populations that most needed it.
Most could benefit from it, yeah. That it seems interesting to me that, well, I mean, mostly what I know about jail is from TV shows, right? So you have a more personal experience of that, but it seems like it would be a very difficult place to be vulnerable. And when we're doing the counseling work, obviously you have to get vulnerable or you can't get down to the stuff you need to work through.
Sure.
But it sounds like through some of those methods that you were just describing, that you gave them a place where they could cry. Like, it might not be safe to cry in other parts of the jail, or it might not be safe to kind of tune out and do some of that trauma work because you have to have your guard up.
Correct. And I wanted two brief stories. I know you've got your questions to go through, Anne, but
that's okay. I like stories.
One particular, someone had found out that they were sentenced to quite a bit of time beyond the 6 to 12 months. So they found out they were going to be there for a while. And so, of course, there was, along with the crisis model of referrals, there are striations of urgentness, for better use of the term. And so, for this one, people were concerned that she would self harm based off of the charges and the sentence. So, went out there to see her. She's crying, but she's also starting to convulse. And at, I think any normal person at that time, including myself, would have just called over the nurse and said, "Hey, can you please take this woman's vitals and be able to support?" But in the moment, and again, I think I'm speaking with a fellow Christian, right? So I put out my hand. I said, I'm literally doing this, and feel free to grab my hand. And again, I'm a tough guy. I played football and basketball, and so she didn't need me to ask. And so she grabs my hand with both hands and violently holds on for dear life, almost as if she was reenacting a trauma. And does this for what felt like 5 minutes, but really was probably more like 75 seconds, and is holding on with both of her tiny hands, like just for dear life. And then after about 75 or 80 seconds, lets go, conducts herself, breathing the whole time. And it's almost like she did her own breathing exercise and says, "Okay, I'm okay. Can you walk me back?" Okay, so that was one example of where using tactile stuff instead of me doing talk therapy at her, where I said, "Hey," and granted, I probably pre-COVID should have had a glove or something like that, but made sure to wash my hands fervently afterwards. But you see someone not being able to contain herself, be able to grab something outside of herself, something that is non-threatening, such as a guy's hand, and literally ripping my hand off, and then afterwards discovering I'm okay. I go back now. And so similarly, there was someone that was grieving the loss of a family member, and we'd spent it was a great session, about 25, 30 minutes. And then I said, let's say if her name was Anne, and I know you have to go back, and so your eyes are bloodshot right now. I'm going to give you a few moments to sort of rub your eyes out a bit. I need you to sort of wipe your face because some of your face is a little bit caked over. And so what I was asking her to do was recompose herself to where once she went back into the dorm, she could go back with her dignity, right? Because again, it's not the nicest place. And so if Anne goes back crying, let's say for the audience, and all it takes is the one mean person in the dorm to start a fight with her and say, "You bleep, 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 you weak, blah, blah, blah human being." Knowing, because frankly, some of them were either jealous that there was a counselor that would come out to help this person. Right. So all these sort of interesting relational dynamics, but oftentimes if there were tears, I would allow them to have the tears, and then almost like a spigot saying, "Hey, I want you to be okay when you go back. Please compose yourself. I'll give you 2 minutes. I'll even go outside and step outside the door and obviously observe you. But then once you go back, just pretend nothing happened." Right. And of course, you would not say that I don't think I would say that in a private practice office to one of my patients, but I think in this case, because the risk is there to go back and to be harmed or to be ridiculed. Right.
Actually, I was thinking while you were saying that I use this term, and I'm sure we heard it from one of our grad school professors, but sometimes counseling makes you feel like you've been unzipped, and before you go back into your real life, sometimes you have to zip, because even if you're not going into like a prison dorm or something like that, you are going either back to your work day, back to your children, back to your spouse, back to whatever tasks you have to do for that day. And if you walk around feeling unzipped, you're just too vulnerable. And so I usually do, even in private practice, help people just take a minute. Like sometimes it will even be something stupid like playing a round of Uno at the end of a session, or talking about our favorite band, or talking about something silly right at the end, so that there's a moment of a lightness so that they can get that composure again to be able to attack the rest of their day.
Correct. Yeah. No, I see your point. I want to validate that. And I don't necessarily play Uno with my folks in private practice, but I'm down a long hallway at the facility I'm at, and so I will often walk them out to the front door. And at times, again, I probably need to specialize at some point in like suicide and self-harm assessments. I just haven't gotten around to it, but I will ask them like, "Hey, I know it's a 20-minute drive home. Can you text me when you get home?" Right, and just sort of creating that linkage between my office and their home, and then the expectation they'll come back in a week or 2 or 3 that we'll resume where we left off, or maybe we don't resume where we left off, but I let them drive the car of the therapy session. Yeah, you're right. You're spot on right.
And even for you as a therapist to have some of that time to recompose yourself if it's been a difficult session.
Sure. Yeah. I think if anything, for my folks that want to do this work and eventually want to work in custody, I think one of the benefits of, I would say probably more so a county jail system than a prison system is, there is a long walk back to the office, or there's a long walk back to a different part of the campus, particularly at Elmwood. And so you can recompose yourself and do your breathing
Mhm.
as you're walking. And I think the thing to point out for me is I really cherish and love doing the groups because, again, it's nice to see sort of humanity come together in that moment. But you're right, it's exhausting. And so typically after the groups, I would spend a bit of time in meditation and walk back to my office and then rest a bit before going to lunch. But because oftentimes these groups are right around lunchtime,
Yeah.
but there needs to be that zipping up, literally and figuratively.
Yeah. I don't know if did you ever work at the Christian Counseling Center when you were an intern?
Yeah, I'm actually still there part time.
You are there. Okay. At the Bascom Avenue location?
No, for some reason I ended up in Mountain View, and now it's the Sunnyvale Los Altos site. So
Okay.
it's interesting the dichotomy between the Sunnyvale and Los Altos sites. It's
Yeah.
sort of like
It's different.
Beverly Hills versus West LA, but I mean, you can probably edit that out. But anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to cut in your
Yeah,
question.
no, it's funny. Well, just for our listeners, there was a Christian counseling center that a lot of us as interns kind of started getting our hours at. It was right up the street from our campus, and my apartment was right across the street from the counseling center. And so, even though I was, a beginning intern working the worst hours in the worst offices, my husband would walk over in the evening after I was done counseling, and we would walk back through the dark back to my neighborhood. And that time of just walking after seeing clients was the time that I needed to decompress. And so it's good for whatever kind of stressful work you do to have that kind of moment.
Certainly, I wonder if there is application for your audience, those that are doing ministry. Like we need to not book ourselves
Yeah.
session after session after session after session, but actually build in the space, or at the end of all the sessions, then
Mhm.
to go have a nice breakfast, or to be with your spouse, or be with your lover or partner.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's a good euphemism for all the work that we do.
Yeah. That's great. So I do want to ask you, since you brought up ministry, I know you're active, you preach sometimes, you have different ministry roles. Um, did you ever get to have like a ministry moment? And the things that you're doing, caring for people, that is ministry in itself. But sometimes I think in this situation, you might not be able to get really open about the gospel or something like that. But can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I would say just for your audience's sake, and frankly, friendly reminder for myself. But since we are licensed in the state of California as marriage and family therapist, we generally, people do not know that I'm a Christian. Although people figure it out for some reason, that people think I have those words written on my forehead
Yeah.
for some odd reason. But I think people figure it out that either because I was this is the inmates' terms, but a goody two shoes, or that I was a square. Even though I'm built like a probation officer or a sheriff's, but I think they determined my tenderness, was probably, I was in a different field. And so, if anything, I'd like to talk briefly outside of custody, the ministry moment that I'm going through, and it's an interesting story behind it. I was on my way to a job interview last October, so almost a year and a half ago, and the irony is, and I think, Anne, you probably know the situation in terms of knowing my personal history, but I get this random text for someone that I was interested in grad school for quite some time, and thought we were going to end up together for a while. And so this person says, "Can you go speak at my friend's church?" Right. And so I'm right about to go into an interview. I'm all like dressed to the nines. And so I briefly said, "Sure, I'll text after the interview." Right. And without revealing the name of the congregation or the church, it is a local church here in the Bay Area, where sadly an elder ran off with a ton of money. And so that devastated the church. And so in that sense, when we talk about ministry moments, I've been preaching there almost every month since October 2020. And, to be fair, I think, God requires a humility about the work. And so I think that's probably why he's given you this blessing and given me my blessing in that sense. But doing a sermon a month. Someone said that's almost like a part-time gig, and I was like, you're right, right. But I think part of it is seeing the devastation that happens when you have a selfish church leader and is frankly a spouse utilize funds for the kingdom for their own selfish, greedy desires. That's sort of hard me to sort of speak to the congregation, and so maybe not a ministry moment, like I don't do altar calls or anything like that, but someone just sort of told me in passing, hey, because they're still pastorless right now, and so they will have guest speakers come in all the time, and apparently when I go there, that's usually when most of the teenagers come out to service. So it's got to mean something. I don't know if that means I'm entertaining
You're the
or
cool pastor, huh?
the cool guy with the sunglasses, but that stuff matters to me. That essentially you and I you were at some point in that role in the chair, uncertain about what the future beheld, and seeing this crazy old guy run off with $8 million of church funds, that sort of stuff, and easily that could send someone heading off in a different direction. But for me, I think where we can intervene kingdom wise, and I'll get back to the custody stuff in a moment, but to say, hey, I'm willing to come speak so long as the church doesn't feel like I'm being apostate or not preaching from the word. And thankfully, I've had Dr. Tuck's classes at Western Seminary, so I hope I'm not messing with things. And so that's what I'm saying. Like the last 16 months have been both interesting and sometimes challenging, given in our culture it's an Asian church, and so oftentimes you get these stone-faced congregationists. And so, but on the other end, I couldn't turn down an opportunity to uplift people. Even though this person rejected me anyway, that's a whole different, maybe a different podcast about dating rejection. But we remain friends to this day. But just to have the opportunity that someone trusts me to speak to this congregation and not make it about myself or try to be Mr. Splash guy, that sort of thing, that means a lot. And then in custody, I think in the moments where people ask, so what's your spiritual journey? Then I could say, well, I can't speak exactly to what it is, but it does involve the old scriptures, and so I'll use sort of pepper in terms that will make sense for a lot of people that have grown in the church. But it also leaves some freedom for the agnostics and the atheists and the undecided folks to say, well, Gary's not trying to proselytize me, but I can talk to this guy. I can talk to this guy about my stuff.
Yeah.
But this kind of, my wife says I sort of occupy a very marginal space in society. And I kind of revel in it. I kind of do enjoy that because, again, I think ideally in most days, I think it would be what Jesus would demand of you and me, and is to be present, but also not to overwhelm people with at least my version of the gospel or that sort of stuff. Just to be loved and to be held in the moment by someone that doesn't want anything from them. Maybe that's what I was working around too.
Okay. That's interesting that your wife used that term marginal. Can you say a little bit more about that? What is that little slice?
Sure. It's interesting. I mean, I have the CCC thing, the Christian Counseling Center thing, and I don't advertise. So it's interesting that people word of mouth from some other person in the Christian community. And again, the risk is that someone can get big headed for that. So that's one thing I try to make sure I keep in check, is that, typically I don't advertise because I'm too busy with, talking with you this hour or going to the jails or, teaching in classes, which is really where I most come alive. And so I'm teaching at a Catholic school, a Jesuit school, and a secular business school. And I find that I'm essentially me wherever I'm at the school. And the students have tended to, by and large, really appreciate that I support them and that I try to come across in a way that sort of, I don't, aside from the textbooks, I don't bring in any content that's older than 4 or 5 years old. I want the stuff to be present for them as it was for me at Western. So I want to create this like magical experience for grad school students, but also in the jails, to make it also a magical experience, but something that for folks, especially still suffering from detox and withdrawals. And so what I think she meant by marginal is like, I get to go to these places thanks to the doors that God's opened to be me, to be loving and to be caring.
Yeah.
And hopefully to be edifying. And it works, for the most part, it works. Aside from the few times I've encountered opposition, I had an unfortunate set of circumstances cause my departure from the custody system, but now I'm back in a different and even better capacity as a professor there. And
Wow.
so in other words, when the doors have closed, of course I've been hurt about it and felt rejected, but I oftentimes, have experienced an even bigger blessing and not materially, obviously, but like bigger blessing and opportunities from those closed doors. And so it allows me to occupy quite a bit of rooms that I would not necessarily maybe occupy if I was working as a pastor or working as a youth minister in a church setting. So
Yeah.
I think the right term would be parachurch. I don't think it was meant to mean like marginally marginal, but
Hmm.
perhaps parachurch settings where people feel
But you have access to some settings that a pastor might not have.
certainly, yeah.
Hmm. Okay.
Although I'd like them to, but again, it just speaks to. I imagine this is probably your attitude as well. Wherever the work is that God has, right?
Hmm.
That's what we do and where we go.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, even raising kids and sending them to public school, it's like there's got to be Christians coming into some of these situations that are maybe not always God honoring, or there may be a lot of hurting people. And so we're going to continue to do public school for our kids until God sends us otherwhere or otherwise, because that's part of our mission, just like it's your mission to be around all some really broken people in incarceration. And we're around broken people in a different setting.
Correct, correct.
Hmm. Yeah.
And there's fewer people that can see the uh, the connecting lines there. And I think I appreciate that about you.
Mm, yeah. I did have like some other questions for you, but I feel like we've pretty much covered some stuff and I don't want to overuse your time. So I want to ask you our wrapping up question, which is what are you doing for soul care?
For soul care, I love the term. I wish that you would trademark that and make it pretty cool for your ministry. I have a go-to list of podcasts that I listen to, both edifying and sometimes irreverent. I did listen to Bob Saget's
Mhm.
podcast before he passed on earlier this
Yeah.
year. So
Yeah.
I'm very fascinated with the human condition as a Christian person, and so that lens definitely gets put on. So I have a go-to list of sports podcasts. I love sports.
Hmm.
I also blog for a professional, the number one fan site for professional basketball teams. So, for instance, I'm doing the game recap for them tomorrow afternoon,
Wow.
and so thankfully my wife has let me do that. And also just speaking of how great my wife is, so we do a sports trip every year. So I forget what part of the country you're in, but we're going to Nashville in 4 weeks, presumably to check in on my career mentor as well as see a hockey game and a basketball game. So we
Awesome.
travel. Granted, COVID has put a huge crimp in that. And then we have these 16 awesome nieces and nephews and godchildren that, it gets expensive during the holidays, but the rest of the year, I had my twin nieces and my other niece hop onto my class the other day just to say hello to the students. And it's very adorable. And one of the students said, thank you for uplifting my serotonin, seeing the kids laugh and smile at them. So I live for those moments. Other stuff. I have this 80s YouTube channel, so not that I made the videos, but I'm just compiling best 80s songs and just putting them on my own little channel for people to listen to, and I don't take any credit for it other than like perusing the Billboard Top 40 for the whole decade and picking the stuff that I love. So a variety of interests to help me stay sober and sane
Yeah.
and to be present, for my family and all that stuff.
Yeah, that's great. I love that you have that wide variety, because a lot of times people will, when I ask the question, the typical, the Sunday school answer is, well, I read my Bible every day. And I assume you do that if you're preaching and stuff, but it's interesting to have like the variety of the sports and the 80s music and the kids, and it's just things that make you feel like more alive and more relaxed and more present. So.
I play Animal Crossing with my niece. So again, I don't know what I'm doing half the time, but she's often come into my island and reviewing my work and my messing with my OCD when it comes to collecting fruits and stuff like that. But yeah, I think the idea is without, granted having good people in my life like yourself and other close friends from Western, I just realize how heavy the burden our work is at times, but also the necessity to keep in touch of people's Facebooks and to say hello every once in a while.
Yep.
And
Yep.
We've had some folks that have suffered a lot of physical maladies and medical maladies that
Mhm.
we check up on. We don't ignore them, right? So I think that sort of that interwovenness is so critical to what I do. And I last example would be, when I had my gallbladder out in 2016, I thought for sure no one would come visit me at the hospital, and so my wife puts out an APB through my Facebook, and my pastor shows up, all my good friends show up, all my groomsmen people showed up, and so I figured, okay, so if I'm just laying in the bed with a body part taken out because I've eaten, frankly, too much fatty food most of my life, and fried chicken, obviously, but that I need to sort of shore up,
Obviously.
yeah, and then I need to shore up my ability to be there and present for other people, since this is my career, right? And so I've had these sort of moments that, frankly, God has provided, and I think this is one of those moments as well. It's just a firm reminder of why I do what I do and why you do what you do, Ann, and that we are doing worthwhile things. And it's heartening to hear that. Yeah.
Yeah. It's really sad, Gary. We both had our gallbladders out after grad school. And I can remember like having breaks on Saturday classes and going and eating fatty food with you.
Yeah. Hey, I still go there sometimes at
We,
Shangri-La place, but yeah,
yeah, we did it to ourselves, huh?
yeah.
Well, I want to thank you too, Gary, for staying in touch because pretty much I can count every year you are the first person to wish me happy birthday on Facebook.
I may not this year because I've just been slow about it since the accident, but
Yeah, well, it was like 3 weeks ago, and I was like, "Where's my Gary Quan birthday greeting?"
yeah, yeah. I'll get back to it in 23, but
Okay, there you
yeah,
go.
I've just sort of taken some time off from the birthdays, and I hope
Yeah.
that doesn't end any friendships
No,
unnecessarily.
it's fine. But I do appreciate you checking in. So,
Yeah, yeah.
well,
Just
thank
know
you so
I
much.
care for you. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you. I care for you too. And I thank you for just being available to do this. I know you're very busy with, it sounds like you have about 14 different jobs. But I do appreciate you coming here today and sharing some of your experiences with us.
Anytime, man. And I hope your audience is edified and encouraged by our time together.
Thank you. The Soul Grit podcast is a production of Soul Grit Resources. You can find more at soulgritresources.com or on the socials at Soul Grit Resources. You can email me at info@soulgritresources.com.